maybe one of the things in these verses that really caught our attention was the seven spirits of God which are before the throne. And we might start by wondering, well, is it really then the Trinity? The Father, the Son, plus seven spirits? That's not a Trinity, that's 9. Well, understanding the numbers, 7, which is the number of holiness, perfection. This number is both symbolic and literal. It's literal in that John actually saw, when we get to chapter 4, 7 lamps before the throne of God. An actual 7 lamps. But it's still one Spirit. And Paul in Corinthians speaks of that when he speaks of the diversity of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. To one is given this, to another is given that, to a third is given this. But it's one and the same Spirit who gives. And if we think back to the book of Exodus and recall that the Lord had Moses make a what? Well, a tabernacle, yes, an altar and all kinds of different things. But inside of it was that 7-branched lampstand. And the whole lamp was fed by one bowl containing the oil. And we know again from Exodus that the things in the temple were copies of things in heaven. And so when we get to chapter 4 and we see and read the 7 spirits that are before the throne of God, there it is. There it is. If you remember from about a year ago, if you listened and watched the videos on when we went through the book of Zechariah, chapter 3, verse 9, and chapter 4, verses 2, 6, and 10, what we run across? The stone with the 7 eyes. The Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit. And so, this is, the number 7 is both literal and symbolic. But it's one and the same Spirit. Now, I'm sure you've heard, there's that hymn, the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit. We probably want to know what they are. Well, if you look at Isaiah 11, verse 2, which reads, and this is from the New King James, we read, well, in verse 1, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and to fear the Lord. And you count those up, Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, fear the Lord. That's 6. Unless you count the Spirit himself. Then you get to 7. Or perhaps we might think of the fruits of the Spirit, for which Paul in Galatians chapter 5, beginning at verse 22, says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law." We're at more than 7. Or maybe we do think from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning at verse 28, or verse 28, where we read, "And God has appointed these in the church, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, administrations, varieties of tongues." It's 8. Or maybe we think of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, where we read, "But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, to another the word of knowledge through the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healings by the same Spirit, to another the workings of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another different kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually as he wills." And so there again, we're at more than 7. And yes, we all want to know and pinpoint exactly those specific 7 flames of the Spirit, 7 gifts of the Spirit. Take your pick. And yeah, you can take from Galatians and the passages in Corinthians and maybe find, a couple or 3 or 4 that might be the same, and so you put them together, and so you finagle it or you work it till you get to 7. That's fine. I'm not going to argue the point. For myself, Isaiah 11:2 seems to be the one to go to. That those gifts are, first of all, the gift of the Spirit Himself. And then you have wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and fear of the Lord. When Jesus was baptized, the Holy Spirit descended on Him in the form of a dove. And it's not to say that up until then Jesus didn't have the Holy Spirit. He certainly did. But there was the manifestation, because it was the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Anyway, we find the Holy Spirit in the diversity of His gifts that He gives within the church to individuals, as Paul says, for the benefit of all. And as Paul says and reminds us, it's one and the same Spirit. The 7 are not 7 individual Holy Spirits. All these things come from the same Spirit, and so we still have the Trinity.